Salvete stella populo. I'm not sure why I felt compelled to say greetings, star people in Latin. Maybe it's because we're living through a medieval plague, so it seemed appropriate to the times. You'll also have to forgive my Google translated Latin and my own likely butchered pronunciation. Quality control is the first thing to go during the plague. Seriously though, I hope everyone is doing well. I can't fix anything that's wrong with the world, but perhaps I can provide a few minutes of distraction talking about astroimaging. In the last 2 weeks, I've had discussions with 3 different people about how to handle data from multiple nights in PixInsight's weighted batch preprocessing script. That got me to thinking that a video might be useful, so here we are. Let's start with a little background. The weighted batch preprocessing script is the successor to the batch preprocessing script, and it does a great job if all your data comes from one night. You just load all your lights and calibration frames, choose your options, and you get a set of registered frames or even integrated masters out. But what happens when you have data from 2 or more nights and you need to take flats for each night? There is no simple way to handle that in a single WBPP session. If you load the flats from multiple nights, they will get grouped together into one master flat instead of one master flat for each night. However, with a little careful file management, there is a process that will work. Before we begin, let's define our problem a little bit more carefully. I'm assuming you're using a cooled one-shot or monochrome camera. If you're using monochrome, it doesn't matter if you're using broadband, narrowband, or some combination. Let's define a session as the set of lights and flats that were taken together. Since I take flats, each night that I set up, I get 1 session per night. If you reuse your flats over multiple nights, then that group of lights and flats is a session. For example, if you use flats over 3 nights, you can group those flats with the lights from those 3 nights as 1 session. If you don't have a cooled camera, and you take darks and possibly flat darks each night, then group those darks in with the flats for session counting purposes. For cooled cameras, you will have a set of master darks that you use for all sessions. If you use bias frames, then you should be able to use a master bias regardless of whether your camera is cooled. In the example we're going to look at here, I'm using data acquired with an ASI 1600mm Pro, a cooled monochrome camera. All of this starts with careful file management. The way I approach this is not the only way, but keeping your files organized on disk certainly helps avoid mistakes down the road, and also aids in finding your data should you come back to it in the future. In my main astrophotography directory, I first create a directory for my acquisition program, Nina in this case. Within that directory, I create a directory for each camera I have. In my case, the ASI 294 and the ASI 1600. Within each camera directory, I create a calibration directory and a directory for each telescope. In my case, I'm only imaging with a single telescope, but if I ever add another one, this will help me keep the data organized. Let's start with the calibration directory. I make a directory for the month I created these calibration frames. At some point in the future, when I recreate my dark library, I'll create a new directory for that month. Inside the date directory, I create a directory for each gain-offset combination that I use. In my case, I'm using the ZWO ASCOM driver, so my offset is fixed at 50 for each gain. I have 3 gains I might use, 25, 139, and 200. In this example, we are looking at a narrowband image that used gain 200. I put all of my darks and flat darks for gain 200 in this directory. If you were using bias frames instead of flat darks, you would also put those here. Inside of that directory, I create a directory called processed that will contain the output of my WBP run to create the master darks. To create our dark library, let's run WBPP. Make sure any files from previous runs are already cleared out. And in this case, we'll go to that dark gain 200 directory and add all of the files. Make sure the exposure tolerance is set to 0 so that your darks don't inadvertently get grouped together. These are the exposures for the darks and flat dark exposures that I use. Set the output directory to a process directory inside that dark directory, and run. When you run, you'll get warnings about not having any bias, flat, or light frames. The warning is correct, but we don't need them. In this case, we're not using bias frames, and our goal is just to produce the master darks, so there's no need for flats or lights. Now that WBPP is finished, check the log. And if everything looks okay, your new master frames are ready to use. Now that we have our master darks, we can look at how to manage the data for our nightly sessions. As I mentioned earlier, I create a directory within the camera directory for the OTA flattener combination. In my case, that is an SV83SV. Inside of that, I create another directory for the year, and then within that, a directory for each target. If a target spans a year boundary, I just keep adding it to the year in which it started. I name things with a letter prefix so they are kept in order of acquisition, but that's not strictly necessary. It's my OCD librarian nature coming through. Name these however makes sense to you. Just be consistent. Now, let's get set up for an actual run. Within each target directory, I will have one or more session directories. I just name them session 1, session 2, and so on. You could also name them by date, but for me the date isn't really important. I just need to know which files belong to which session. I also create top-level directories called calibrated and processed for each target. Here, we've completed the first night's acquisition on NGC 1701. Inside the session 1 directory, we have flats and lights for H-alpha and O3. In general, each session directory contains all the lights and flats for that session. If you aren't using a dark library and need to take darks each night, then it would also contain your darks for that session. When you're putting files into the session directory, you can make a subdirectory for each filter, but it's simpler to put all the flats and lights together in the same directory. WBPP will handle grouping them just fine, so long as your acquisition software tags them properly. It's faster to load them all at once rather than have to add them filter by filter. There's nothing wrong if you do choose to group it that way, it's just more work for you when adding the files into WBPP. Be sure to check the Calibrate Only checkbox and to turn on cosmetic correction and choose your template if you want cosmetic correction to run. So let's start by adding our O3 and HA flats and lights, which we have 300-second lights, and we have 2-second and 0.4-second flats. We also need our master darks that we created. Let's go back over to our calibration directory and grab those. Now you can grab all of them or just the ones that you need. There's no harm in having the extra ones there, they just won't be used. Make sure you have Use Master Dark checked. We have a process directory here inside the session directory. We'll go ahead and use that. We've checked calibrate only. And again, if you want to use cosmetic correction, you can turn that on and choose your template. Now we're ready to run. And you may get this warning message. What it's telling you to do is to turn the Calibrate Master Darks on, and that will eliminate that message. Again, we'll still be warned that we don't have any bias frames, which is correct. We don't, but that's okay because we're using flat darks instead. Now WBPP is going to run our first session. It'll create the master flats for the session, and then it will calibrate all the light files. Unfortunately, it will also calculate subframe weights, even though we told it just to calibrate. This will happen even if you take care to clear the checkbox for calculate subframe weights. There's no harm in this, but it does waste time. In theory, you could use the older batch preprocessing script here instead, which would avoid the problem. But since WBPP produces a cleaner, more meaningful log output, I'm willing to put up with this overhead. So we'll fast forward to the end of this session and take a look at our output. Now that WBPP is finished, let's check the logs. Everything looks clean. We get these messages about no filter. I think that's a bug in the script. It actually does handle the filters correctly. Now, let's take a look at what we got in the file system. If we look at our calibrated directory, we have all of our light frames calibrated. At the end of each session after calibration, I take those calibrated lights and move them here to the top level calibrated directory for the target. And now the first day's calibration is completed. All we need to do is wait for the next clear night to get the next session. We finally got our next clear night, and we were able to gather our sulfur, flats, and lights. So now let's run WBPP again for our second session. Make sure to clear out yesterday's work. We can still keep our master darks. Clear the use master flat. And now let's choose the second day's worth files. You can see we just have 300-second sulfur lights and 4-second sulfur flats. Again, verify that calibrate only is checked, use master dark is checked, and that use master flat is cleared. Let's set our output directory to a process directory inside of session 2 and run. Oh, we got that warning again. Let's turn that on and run. This warning we expect, and that's okay. So we'll let our second session run and see what kind of output we get. Our second session has completed. and we have calibrated frames. Let's copy these up to that calibrated directory. It's been a few more days. We finally did, though, get our third session in. We now have more hydrogen alpha and more oxygen 3 frames. So let's calibrate those. Let's clear out the previous session. We still have our master darks. So we have HA and O3 frames and HA and O3 flats. Let's make our processed directory. And again, let's run. Our third session is completed. You can continue this sequence of acquisition followed by calibration for as many nights as you want. In my most ambitious project to date, I had 11 sessions, thanks to the relatively high horizons in my backyard. For now, we'll be satisfied with what we have and move on. Let's take the calibrated lights from our third session. And copy them into our calibrated directory. So we have 117 5-minute lights split between HA, O3, and S2. Let's go ahead and actually produce our final image. First thing we want to do, of course, is clear out anything from the past. We're done with our darks for the moment, so we can clear those as well. Let's add all of those files from the calibrated directory. And you can see we have our 3 filters. I wish WBPP would tell us how many of each filter we have, but it doesn't. Again, we need to set our output directory. In this case, I'm going to use this target level process directory. I'm going to clear the calibrate only frame, or excuse me, I'm going to clear the calibrate only checkbox. I do want subframe weights here, and we will choose Galaxy for our subframe weighting formula. Tell it use the best frame as a reference for registration. I will generate drizzle data. My data is undersampled, so drizzle data is often useful. For registration parameters, we'll use auto. And I will do image integration, again, with auto rejection. Again, we should be set. When we run, we get a series of warning frames that basically tell us we don't have any calibration frames. That's correct, we don't. But we've already calibrated all of our lights, so we don't need any calibration frames. The script will actually skip over calibration, go straight into subframe weighting, then registration, then integration. Let's go ahead and start that process. All right, the script has finished. We can inspect the log for any errors. And we can see, if we look in the target's process directory, calibrated is empty in the light frames because we didn't do any calibration. Registered has our registered frames, and we have our 3 integrated masters. So we've gone from individual sessions to a final integration master by using 4 WBPP sessions. So in general, if you have n sessions, you'll run n+1 instances of WBPP. I hope this process for handling data acquired in multiple sessions is useful to you. If you have any ideas or questions, please let me know in the comments. Hopefully the PixInsight team will eliminate the unnecessary and unwanted extra waiting steps when doing calibrate-only runs. Even better would be the ability to handle multiple sessions within a single run. However, even with these limitations, weighted batch preprocessing is a fairly straightforward tool for handling data acquired over multiple nights. Clear skies, and I hope everyone is staying safe during the pandemic of 2020.